Before we get started, read each of the statements on the slide and decide. Do you think it's an example of formative assessment, and why or why not? Pause the slide as needed and resume when you're ready. We'll get back to those answers in just a minute, but before we do, let's look at the definition of formative assessment. Formative assessment is defined in the HCS curriculum as any task or assessment, formal or informal, that is used to inform instructional decisions. So think for a moment about the key words in this definition. If we had to pull out keywords, we'd choose used and inform instructional decisions. The word used is very important because the definition of whether an assessment is formative or not needs to be determined based on the way that the assessment is used, not its actual format. In other words, anything can be used as a formative assessment if it is used to make instructional decisions. So we said that formative assessments can be formal or informal, and frequently people confuse the terms formative and summative with formal and informal. Formal and informal describe the format of the assessments, whereas formative and summative describe how the assessments are used. So informal assessments typically take less upfront planning and are interwoven into instruction. For instance, observation is probably one of the most informal types of assessment. If I ask a question and no one answers, I will most likely either reword my question or infer that I need to review the concept I asked about because students don't know the answers. So formal assessments, on the other hand, usually require significant advanced planning and instruction stops while the assessment is conducted. For instance, when teachers give tests, those tests are planned ahead of time and instruction stops while students take the assessments. Lastly, let's go back to our first activity and determine whether each example is being used formatively. So number 1, students are writing in their journals and the teacher is reading the work, but only looking at completion. The teacher isn't using this information to inform instruction, so it is not an example of formative assessment. Number 2, students are taking a critical skills assessment and the teacher is using that information to make future instructional decisions. Therefore, this is an example of a formal assessment that is being used formatively. All right, number 3, the teacher asks a question and no students answer, so the teacher revisits the previous day's lesson. This is an example of an informal assessment being used formatively. And number 4, students complete a performance assessment and their grades are reported in the district's grading system. Well, there's no mention of the results being used to inform instruction, so we cannot conclude that this assessment is being used formatively.